By making a couple of points about definition of pacifism. If you think about the word pacifism, right, it comes from the Roman word pax. Pax is specifically a political term. It's about the relationships between nations, right? So for the Romans, there were political entities that they recognised as basically as states like Rome, and they could make peace with them, right, as against the barbarians. So, and when pacifism as a word came into the English language, it specifically referred to a view about international relations, about the possibility of solving disputes between states in non-violent ways. And if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, I mean, what people who write dictionaries are supposed to do is record linguistic practice. They're not the authorities, we're the authorities. They're supposed to just to record what we actually say. If you look at what the Oxford English Dictionary says, what we say, the first definition of pacifism in that book says something along the following lines. Pacifism is the belief that it's possible and desirable to settle disputes between states without war. I mean, that's my sort of somewhat inaccurate memory, but there's no doubt it's more or less that's the first definition, the first sense of the term pacifism. Anyway, I'm very glad that Cheney gave the talk that he gave for two reasons. One, I thought it was a terrific talk, but secondly, it made a number of points that sort of make it, I think, in various ways much easier for me to say the kinds of things that I want to say. So I suppose I should just get on and say them. National armies are at the heart of the institution of war, the tools which are dedicated to the preparation for and fighting of wars, which include not only those extensive standing armies, armaments manufacturers, intelligence agencies and the like that all modern states possess, but also the rules and norms that govern the use of those tools. According to those rules, the legitimate goals of national armed forces are to deter external violent usurpation of political authority and to resist such usurpation if it nevertheless attempted. Basically what I want to do in this paper is try and provide a kind of imminent critique of the view that the best way of doing the things that national armies are supposed to do is by having national armies. And so pacifism, or one of the implications of pacifism as I'll be understanding it, is the view that it's possible and desirable to replace national armies, and if national armies go, the institution of war goes, with other institutionalised social arrangements which will achieve those goals without the organised exercise of violence. Now, of course, the exact shape of such arrangements can only be vaguely discerned from where we now sit, but I think we have enough information to see that their general outlines and to start to have a reasoned discussion about their merits relative to the status quo. So pacifism, as I'm understanding it, is a view about institutional design, and it's that view is not in, as far as I can see, an eccentric claim. I mean, when I wrote a paper about pacifism years ago, partly for exactly the kind of reasons that Cheney was pointing to, that the sort of discussion that I could find in the philosophical literature of pacifism just didn't seem to connect with my own reading in that tradition. It just didn't have anything to say about the tradition. In various ways I thought it was, just not speaking to the tradition. And if you want to talk about pacifism, presumably you have to look at people who everyone thinks of as pacifists. So it's possible to be a pacifist in that sense without thinking, for example, that violence could never be or is justified, as, for example, many Quakers have thought and as Gandhi thought, and Cheney's given one of the quotes. Though it's also possible, obviously, to be a pacifist precisely because you do believe that. Now, seen in this kind of way as a view about institutional design, the issue between the pacifist and the non-pacifist becomes one of disagreement about what kinds of institution or institutions will better bring about mutually desired results. Like the pacifists, their reasonable opponents at least agree that violence is in itself a bad thing. Since at least the end of the Second World War, what might be called a broadly liberal conception of political violence has underpinned the institution of war, a view which is consistent with standard moral and legal views about interpersonal violence, at least in modern societies. On the liberal conception of interpersonal violence, an individual's basic rights, such as the right to bodily integrity and autonomy, entail that others aren't justified in using violence either as an end in itself or as a means to the achievement of some pre-existing end, where doing so would violate the rights of the subject of violence. Notwithstanding, violence or the threat of violence can become justified and in some cases obligatory, given certain conditions conditions which themselves reflect the status of violence as something that is in itself bad and so to be avoided, other things being equal, and which imply that while its use might be justified, those who resort to violence incur an onus of justification. The first of those conditions is that violence is a response to the potential or actual violation of basic rights, to deter or prevent them or to rectify them if they nevertheless occur. Other conditions include proportionality. The violence done is supposed to be proportional to the threat of harm, necessity, that is, the harm will probably occur unless violence is used, and so-called last resort, that is, that other ways of avoiding the harm, if such there be, have been attempted without success. Now, last resort is somewhat of a misnomer. It doesn't literally mean that violence can't be resorted to until every possible alternative has been tried and failed. It does mean that there should be at least a serious effort to consider whether there are other feasible, not excessively costly alternatives to violence, and if there are, to exercise them. An implication of the last resort condition is that even if someone is justified in using violence to avoid a serious rights violation on a particular occasion, because they've tried all feasible alternatives to the use of violence, they can nevertheless be blameworthy and certainly imprudent for allowing themselves to be in such a situation if it were, say, predictable that it could arise, but wouldn't have if they'd taken available alternative action. So, coming back to Cheney's grandma, if she had the habit of hanging out in the rough part of town and then, a mugger turns up and she clobbers him, she's justified in doing so, but Cheney might still be justified in taking her aside and having a stern word to her about, her foolishness in continually going back to the same place where she knows that she's likely to find that kind of thing happening to her. Now, the same general approach to violence is now incorporated in the rules governing international relations. States aren't supposed to use violence either as an end in itself or as a means to further their ends, but may be justified in using it when the conditions outlined above apply, suitably adjusted, of course, for the difference in the nature of the agents involved. The institution of war, the very existence of that institution, presupposes that nevertheless states are disposed to use violence illegitimately. If it were assumed that states will never resort to unjustified violence, then surely there'd be no need or even justification for them to have specialised organisations which are dedicated to the use of coercive force against other states. Okay, so it presupposes that states are disposed to use violence illegitimately, and that the states who are the victims of that violence may be justified in responding violently and in developing organisations which allow them to do so. It's this last claim, that states may be justified in developing organisations dedicated to the provision of violence, that is, armed forces, which I think stands most in need of justification by those who accept the liberal view of violence. As I claimed earlier, an agent may be justified in using violence on a particular occasion, but nevertheless be blameworthy for allowing themselves to be in such a situation where it was predictable that it could arise, but wouldn't have if they'd taken available alternative action. The institution of war is premised on the notion that states do face the realistic possibility of being subject to violence, that is, that such violence is predictable, and of course, that seems, given the history, it is obviously predictable, though obviously not inevitable. Now, is there a realistic alternative? Okay, so Cheney's grandma could have gone somewhere else, but do we have any realistic alternative to setting up these institutions of violence in the face of the predictability of being subject to violence? Since the onus of justification is on those who use or prepare to use violence, one might imagine that this would be a question to which those who support the current institution of war and current things like standing armies should have and would have carefully addressed. In fact, it's virtually never discussed. If you look at the philosophical literature, there's virtually no attempt to discuss it. There's vast amounts of literature about, say, just war theory and so on. But if you actually, Walz's book's a good example, right? He just assumes, presumes the institution of war. And of things like armies and so on. There's not even an attempt to seriously discuss, is there some other way that we could achieve these good things without having armies, without having the institution of war and so on? Why not? Well, the reason I take it is that it's accepted that, as most of the small amount of philosophical literature in this, on this issue concludes, and I think Jan Nafson's paper done a fair bit of damage in this respect, there's no realistic alternative to developing and, if needs be, using national armies and that in particular pacifistic resistance falls so far below the level of effectiveness that it need not be taken seriously. So the thought is, okay, so is there another realistic alternative if something as serious as the kind of harms that we could be subject to? We better make sure that that if we want to take some other alternative seriously, well, it has some chance of actually being effective in the face of violence. And the thought is, well, the claim is that, well, actually, it's just kind of hopeless, right? Since, of course, no nation has actually relied purely on organised pacifistic resistance to confront invasion and so on, claims about the potential effectiveness of such a policy must be speculative. But, of course, that claim cuts both ways. This is true of those who deny its effectiveness as it is of those who affirm it. Now, we have increasing evidence of the power of non-violent action in affecting political change. We've seen a lot of it over the last few years in the Middle East and other places, and we've got, but not only over the last few years. I mean, I think over the last 100 years, we've got lots of evidence that non-violent resistance, non-violent action can be effective in affecting political change, can be effective in resisting violence. And I've argued elsewhere, I've provided, I think, a suite of powerful and persuasive arguments, which unfortunately I can't provide here, but they're certainly powerful and persuasive enough to persuade me that we do have good reason to think that it can be effective enough to be at least taken seriously. So the thought is we've got to think that if there's an alternative, there's got to be a chance that it's going to be effective. I think we do have reason to think that non-violent resistance can reach some level of effectiveness. Now, some reasonable level of effectiveness is clearly a necessary condition for a policy which, say, aims to protect the state from violent usurpation, as that's what things like national armies are supposed to do. But assuming that condition is satisfied by more than one such policy, we need to assess and compare them in terms of their all things considered merits. And one of the things which fits under that heading, the heading of all things considered, is the relationship between the institutional arrangements for defence and the political values which those arrangements are supposed to preserve. Right? So that's under the current way of thinking about it. Basically, we only have these things, armies, as protectors of values that we hold. Before considering some of the factors which seem salient to making this kind of all things considered evaluation, let me point to another implication of the liberal view which is relevant here. On the liberal conception, the ideal world is one in which there's no violation of rights and hence no need for violence. And a fortiori, no place for organisations of violence. The best possible world is the one in which as much as possible of what would happen in the ideal world still happens. Right? We can't live in the ideal world, so we want to construct the best possible world, and that's one that's going to be as close as we can get to the ideal world. So organisations of state violence are thus guardians. They're dedicated to the realisation of this world. There are thus two overriding pragmatic desiderata for such organisations and the regulatory framework within which they operate: effectiveness in preventing and limiting violence and other rights violations, and what might be called neutrality. This notion of neutrality connotes that the operations of those organisations should impinge as little as possible on the legitimate activities of the public they protect and allow the resumption of normal life as fully and quickly as possible after conflict. Of course, in practice they always do have some impact, if merely because they're costly, so a system of taxation or the like will have to be put in place to fund them. Though those two desiderata, effectiveness and neutrality, are not logically incompatible, there's a kind of de facto tension between them, because many of the most obvious ways of increasing the effectiveness of institutions of violence, such as giving them greater powers to monitor and restrict suspect actions or people, clearly reduce neutrality. In any case, since those organisations have no independent intrinsic value, the desideratum of neutrality tells us that they should be as small and non-intrusive as is compatible with effectiveness. Now, pacifist resistance doesn't involve the use of violence, so it isn't simply a guardian, and it's not necessarily something whose effect on society should be minimised as far as possible. In fact, as I'll argue below, it might be actually valuable, though it does need to be at least compatible with the political values of the society it's supposed to protect. Now, deciding what is compatible with political values presupposes that we know what those values are, and there's obviously a good deal of disagreement about that. And I'm just going to simply assume a broadly liberal democratic view, according to which the people are sovereign, and individuals and groups should be allowed to pursue their own conception of the good, compatible with others doing likewise, and that society is, or at least aspires to be, constituted by a community of autonomous, enlightened beings engaged in critical dialogue with each other, as well as the institutions that embody and provide scope for the exercise of such critical dialogue in their operations, such as universities, free press, parliament, and so on. So call those institutions Kantian institutions. Now, both pacifist and military defence systems change over time as new technologies and forms of social organisation develop. So I take it that developments in information technology, for example, have been very important in the effectiveness of non-violent resistance and non-violent action in recent years. So it's at least possible that they're all things considered ranking. The rankings of those two different approaches will vary in the light of changing contingencies. And there are many ways in which they could be arranged, and in the case of military systems, already at least some serious variations across different states. Obviously, Israel does things rather differently, say, for example, than Australia does. Moreover, what a state-supported pacifist system would look like must be to some extent a matter of speculation. However, there's some broad generalisations which hold for all major military systems and some others which hold for most. So all national systems of military defence have at their core discrete armed forces, which are large, highly specialised organisations, both in terms of their mission and expertise, the provision of high levels of lethal force, and in terms of their equipment. They operate with a centralised decision-making procedure and a hierarchical chain of command. There seems to be two reasons for that structure. Firstly, conventional military activity involves large numbers of people carrying out complex interlocking activities, the success of which relies on a high degree of coordination which can only be brought about through centralised authority. Secondly, the tools of violence can generally be used for purposes other than for national defence. Those who patronise armies need assurance that they'll only be used in the ways they want them to be, and having a hierarchical authority structure which is ultimately answerable to them is a means to that goal, though, as history shows, not a very reliable one. These facts about the military entail a number of others which are directly relevant to assessing the desirability of armed defence relative to pacifist defence. Firstly, they mean the military are very expensive. So in Australia, for example, Australia's got a pretty small military. It's about 60,000, I think, all up. And you know, Australia's a long way away from anywhere. It's just not. It's just not really under any threat, and very rarely has been. Though it does have a penchant for getting involved in other people's fights. But in Australia, military defence constitutes about 7% of total government spending. I mean, it's a very, very substantial expense.
For a 60,000?
Yeah, it's pretty high tech. I mean, yeah. Anyway, of course, and they're very expensive, though economically unproductive. The personnel to staff the organisation, the money to pay that cost, have to come from the people, who are consequently taxed and often conscripted to do so. On some views, if you're a libertarian, for example, if there's some less costly alternative available, the extra resources are being consumed or unjustly taken. On others, they could be spent on more worthy causes. Secondly, these facts mean that there's a well-coordinated organisation which possesses vastly more coercive power than any other in the society, with, of course, consequential potential for usurping political power, the very thing which is supposed to be preventing. And that potential has been consistently realised, with armed coup d'etats a regular feature around the world over the past couple of centuries. In fact, I was actually a bit surprised when I started doing some research on this paper to discover that coups are in fact the single most important proximate cause of the downfall of democratic governments. I mean, I kind of just had a prejudice that democratic governments were kind of relatively immune from military coups. Just not true, right? If you start looking at what's happened to democratic governments over the last 150 years, however, what you'll find is just one after another, they're knocked off by military coups. So it's pretty bad for democracies. It's even worse for non-democracies. Democracies are less prone to coups than non-democracies, and there's a whole literature in political science about why that is, and theories about it. So whatever form of government you set up, you're vulnerable to being knocked off by your army, basically. Even where armies don't themselves usurp political authority, of course their coercive power can be misused by political authority against the people they're supposed to be serving, right? So the armies are supposed to be under control of the politicians are supposed to be serving the people and so on, but of course the politicians can use the army to push the people around. Moreover, most advanced economies also possess substantial armaments industries to supply their own and other states' armies with the arms they need, and those industries themselves possess and actually exercise considerable political influence in virtue of their size. More broadly, there's a sort of cultural tension between the norms of military organisations and those of healthy democracies. So Samuel Huntington, for example, speaks of the military as an instrument of obedience. By definition, an organisation that can be characterised as an instrument of obedience is not a Kantian institution. The habits and minds that are required for people to be effective members of the armed forces, such as deference and unquestioning obedience to authority, respect for people calibrated their position in a hierarchy, and loyalty to the organisation, are directly antithetical to those that are necessary for participation in Kantian institutions. As the military becomes larger and more influential in a society, it may become more difficult to foster the ways of thinking and forms of life that conduce to Kantian institutions. In terms of the desideratum of neutrality, then, the military, I think, does very poorly. Let's consider how a pacifist defence system would compare in those respects, at least where it's comparable. While presumably there'd be a government agency which would provide training in non-violent resistance, help coordinate responses and so on, such an agency wouldn't be anything like the size of current armed forces, and obviously a pacifist defence system doesn't need expensive specialised weaponry. So the cost would be much less. I think there's no possibility, but as I say, given how little we know about how these systems would actually work, but anyway, I think there's no possibility, or perhaps just very little possibility, of such a system being used either to illegitimately overthrow a government, though it could certainly influence political outcomes, or becoming a tool to oppress the populace. Indeed, institutionalised pacifism can take the form of Kantian institution, in which decisions and strategies are made on the basis of open and free discussion by the community as a whole, with the state playing at most a facilitative role. Since such an institution trains people in effective resistance to power, it could in fact stand as an effective bulwark against state oppression, in the way in which, say, the US militia, for example, was originally supposed to do. Right? If you look at why, Americans are supposed to have a right to carry guns, it's not just so that they can shoot each other. It's mainly about, giving them the power to stand up against, or sort of making it impossible for them to be oppressed by the power of the state, by the coercive power of the state. That was the thought anyway. I noted before that in trying to determine the all things considered rankings of both pacifist and military defence systems, we need to be sensitive to changing contingencies, and Jan actually, I think, brought up some of these points, or at least alluded to them earlier on. In fact, armed forces, at least in most Western states, are significantly changing in ways which should be taken into account in assessing their all things considered value. I'll focus on the US as by far the most important military power, and also one about which it's relatively easy to find information, but a lot of the same kinds of things are happening in other comparable places. In the 500 odd years that the modern state system's been evolving, there have been three main forms of military organisation. Until well into the 17th century, mercenaries were the primary source of military force for European powers. They were spectacularly poor in terms of both the desiderata outlined above, effectiveness and neutrality, with states ravaged by the very forces that were supposedly protecting them. The need to generate steady revenue streams to pay for mercenary forces stimulated the development of centralised state finance bodies, which enabled European states to employ soldiers on a permanent basis and form standing professional armies. Those armies were organs of the state, and at least mainly composed of nationals, but in their modes of fighting, culture and isolation from civilian life, and in their role as agents of the rulers of the state, as useful for protection against domestic subversion as foreign usurpation, they resembled their mercenary forebears. The second major transformation was the move from professional standing armies to citizens' armies, the model for which was the French Revolutionary Army. The French Revolution brought into play a radical understanding of the relationship between members of a nation and the state, which is its political expression. The state's charged with preparing for and, if necessary, prosecuting war and entitled to draw on the human material resources of the nation to do so. The people are sovereign, and with popular sovereignty comes not simply universal rights of political participation and control, but universal duties to defend and support the nation. At least, citizens are obliged to contribute to the war effort, the young men by military service. On this conception, the role of the soldier becomes a political office. Civic status and military service are two sides of the one coin. There are no longer citizens or soldiers, but rather citizen soldiers, and the armed forces are seen as continuous with and in the service of the nation rather than the preserve of a separate military caste beholden to a ruling elite, as it had been in the Ancien regime. Conscription became a means both to generate the manpower required by mass armies, especially in times of war, and to distribute the burdens of service equitably. Now, over the past couple of centuries, citizen armies have undoubtedly been more effective than either purely mercenary or purely professional armies could have been. As the success of Napoleon's Grand Army demonstrated, mass mobilisation was necessary for military success in the kinds of interstate wars that remained a possibility for most advanced states from the early 19th until late into the 20th centuries. So, for pragmatic reasons, other European powers were obliged to follow the French model, even when placing military power into the hands of the masses had the potential to subvert the status quo. Popular sovereignty brought with it a particular conception of the accountability relations between the army, the state and the people. The state had authority over and directed the army, which was accountable to it. In turn, the state was accountable for its use of the army to the people on whose behalf it acted. The nature of citizen armies meant that it was difficult for the state to avoid that accountability. Because citizen armies are composed of soldiers whose lives remained intertwined with that of the civilian population, and because the burden of military service is broadly spread through the population, the citizenry have a powerful incentive to concern themselves with the military decisions of the state. Conversely, since the state can effectively prosecute a war using a citizen army only with the ongoing support of the populace, it's obliged to act in ways that will generate and maintain that support. Members of democratic societies in particular have shown a willingness to make the sacrifices necessary to prevail in armed conflicts that threaten the survival of their state, so-called existential threats, or those of their allies, and at the same time a disinclination to do so for conflicts that don't. So there's an interesting book by Gil Moran called How Democracies Lose Small Wars, and it's a great title, and kind of, you're sort of halfway there just by reading the title, I think. So he points to a number of cases like the Vietnam War, the Algerian War of Independence, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, in which democratic states were unable to prevail in wars they prosecuted with citizen armies, all of which included conscripts, despite having a persisting material and military advantage over their foes. And conventional military theory had it, if you've got both a military and a material advantage over your enemy, and that persists through the course of the conflict, you're going to win, right? But they didn't win, and the question is why not? And Merrin argues persuasively, I think, because of the loss of domestic political support that made continuing deployment of troops impossible. So as Cheney Ryan puts it, the way to prevent irresponsible war making was to ensure that its sacrifice would be borne by everyone. Citizens' armies can thus be seen as providing at least some degree of insulation against both internal oppression and external aggression. Now, although all nations retain standing armies, the nature of those armies, at least in most Western states, is undergoing significant changes. I might just skip across why that is, but basically it's partly to do with the big geopolitical changes that have occurred since the end of the Cold War, and partly it's to do with changes in political ideology, and in particular the kind of rise of neoliberalism. So these changes in the missions and also it's to do with so the missions change because basically now we're not going to be fighting wars against states. Tend not to be fighting wars against state. They've got other kinds of concerns. Those changes in the mission and of modern armies and the relationship between state and citizen have produced consequential alterations in the structure and nature of those armies and their relation to the nation they serve. In the US, for example, despite involvement in major conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past decade, a smaller percentage of the population now belong to the armed forces than at any time since before the Second World War, as well as remaining in services for longer periods than previous generations. Members of the military are also less typical of the US population as a whole. They're disproportionately drawn from the rural south, far more likely than the rest of the population to have a parent who served in the military, and less likely to come from either very poor or very well-off backgrounds. They're increasingly likely to identify themselves as politically partisan and overwhelmingly as supporters of the Republican Party. And for the first time in over 100 years, military veterans are now underrepresented rather than overrepresented in Congress. In the light of those facts, it's not surprising that in a recent survey of military veterans and civilians, both groups overwhelmingly agreed that the public understands that the problems that those in the military face are either not too well or not well at all. As the US military have become increasingly detached from the broader society, some members of that society have decreasingly come to see involvement in the nation's war effort as part and parcel of being a citizen. And we've already heard to some extent about that. In short, although the US Army is largely composed of citizens, it's moving away from the ideal of a citizen force in the direction of a professional army. And more of that work is actually being taken up by private contractors, and more of those private contractors, at least in actual theatres of conflict, are not actually citizens, they're locals. Something like in Afghanistan, it's something in the order of over 90% of contractors are Afghanis and not Americans. Those trends are obviously concerning in that they generate an undesirable popular detachment from identification with the members of the armed force and concern about their activities, and hence reduce the forces which in citizen armies act against both internal oppression and external aggression. And they're independently undesirable in unfairly distributing the burdens and benefits of participating in national defence. So in particular, those who benefit the most, that is the most well off, contribute little. Contrast the increasing public alienation from military matters with the likely state of affairs under a pacifist system. Such a system can only be effective if there's a very high level of public engagement. Everyone would need to be engaged in programs of preparation, which would include training not only in non-violent action, but also in the theoretical basis of that action. Unlike the military, in conflict, pacifist organisations would be largely decentralised, encouraging local autonomy and innovation. Okay, so let me provide a very brief conclusion and summary. In this paper, I've argued that we can characterise or perhaps at least a disagreement between the pacifist and the supporter of armed defence as one of policy. What institutional arrangements will best deter and resist attempts to usurp the political realm by force? A necessary condition for a reasonable policy here is that of effectiveness. If we assume effectiveness, we need to make an all things considered judgment about the relative merits of the two policies. What I've focused on in this paper is the relationship between our political values and the institutions which are supposed to be defending them. Since, as is agreed by both sides, violence is a bad thing, institutions dedicated to its provision have no intrinsic value and should have as little impact on the life of societies they're supposed to be protecting as possible. Military institutions actually have significant impact on society, and in some cases, at least, such as the usurpation of political authority, those impacts are directly contrary to the values that they're supposed to be directing. And I've also pointed to recent changes in those institutions which are weakening the constraints on their subversive tendencies. Pacifist institutions, on the other hand, can be arranged in ways which are continuous with the values of the society they're seeking to protect and which don't provide any threat to them.